Hi, welcome to Curator's Corner with the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum, and I'm really excited to welcome you here today to what's going to be an incredible conversation. We have two great speakers. We have the curator in question from the title, Vince Houghton, who is our curator and historian at the International Spy Museum. And we have Eric O'Neill, who is a great friend of the museum. We've been working with Eric for a long time. He does these wonderful surveillance workshops in the streets with me, and we cannot wait to get back out there and chase our rabbits. And Eric is featured in two places in the new Spy Museum. He's both in our Turncoats and Traitors gallery, where he is used to explore Robert Hanssen, who we're talking about today, and give his perspective on this terrible traitor. And he also appears in License to Thrill, where he talks about the film Breach, which is about him. That is so wild to have a movie made about you, and it's a really good movie. So I'm going to turn this over to Vince, and you tell me when you want that PowerPoint. We'll see what I can do.
Fire it up.
All right.
All right, good. You can go to the next slide. Sorry, y'all, you get to hear me tell Amanda to go slide by slide, because if I put the PowerPoint up, I can't see anything. And then I'll forget that I'm on camera, and I'll start nodding off or something, reading a book.
He's always wanted to tell me what to do anyway.
Right, it's important that I can see myself and Eric, so I don't bore Eric either. So what you're seeing on the screen, if you want to know more about this story, we only have a certain amount of time. You should check out Eric's book, Gray Day, which came out recently. Surprisingly, it took him a really long time to get all this down, but he finally did.
There's a reason
after
for that.
a lot of introspection, a lot of thinking about the case. I'd show you my personal copy, but a good friend of mine, Grayson, borrowed it and is reading it because he loves this story. Hi, Grayson. Hi, Sloan. I'm sure they're listening too. Eric, you want to say hello?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everybody. To everybody who didn't get to make our last surveillance operation, I hope you're here and listening. Apologies, but coronavirus. We will redo that once we're all out of our homes. I want to say hi to my family who's actually watching downstairs in the same home, which is sort of weird, to Hannah and Lucas and Emma. And yeah, I want to say hi to my special friends, Grayson and Sloan. Hey man, I hear that you guys have been watching Breach, and I hope you love it.
Well, thank you, Eric. So Amanda, if you kick the slide up one. Oh, the ugly mug of Robert Hanssen. So here's what we're talking about. This man, Robert Hanssen, who probably doesn't look like this right now, because he's spent the last couple decades of his life in a pretty horrible place, and we'll talk about that later on. But this is an official photo of Hanssen when he was an FBI agent, and he is the man who we are focusing on today. But the person we're talking to, Amanda, if you kick us one more slide.
Come on.
And this will be fun because you can
know that picture
below and see that this is a much younger picture of Eric O'Neill. This is probably very close to when you were doing this operation.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about what you did at FBI, because I think there's a misunderstanding about all the different jobs that FBI has. There's certainly one that are in the movies and the TV shows all the time of the special agent running around with the gun, but there are intelligence analysts, there are forensics people, and they're what you did, which was called the ghosts. These are the surveillance experts. So give us a little bit of perspective of what you did at FBI.
Sure. So I was an investigative specialist, and also known as, AKA, the ghosts. My job was to surveil, to track, to investigate in counterintelligence and counterterrorism. So that means following spies and terrorists, finding out which people were the spies, who were the terrorists, and stop them before they could do whatever bad act they were going to do. We were called ghosts because we were trained to work in the shadows. Primarily, we worked in surveillance, which meant that I could follow you from the moment you woke up in the morning until you went to sleep at night, and I could listen to you snore. If you snored, by the way, that was great because I knew you were still in your bed. I'd know through the course of the day how many times you checked your watch or tied your shoes. I would know how many times you stopped to eat, whether you liked fast food or fancy restaurants, whether you shop at budget places or high-end places, whether you like coffee or tea. Every single person you met, every license plate that surrounded you whenever you stopped. I'd know the make, model, and type of your car, who your friends were, everything about you. Because in order, you have to know everything about your target in order to follow them successfully. And I would do it all without being seen. So ghosts have very specific training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Our training is primarily how to work without being seen, so how to blend into situations, all sorts of disguise. We got some great CIA disguise training, but we also learn to be masters of photography, of driving, because obviously you have to follow a lot of people in cars, and that's the most dangerous part of your job, are people with road rage or people who aren't careful on the road. And most importantly, the tradecraft. So the very amazing thing about being a ghost, the best part of the training, was to learn all of the different tradecraft, the way that spies and terrorists operates for all of the different kinds of operatives that we would be pursuing. So the next thing about learning that tradecraft is we could deploy it against others.
And this isn't something the FBI just made up as they went along. You worked with our partners overseas. This is something that MI5 developed going back at least 100 years ago that you learned.
So the MI5 had this. Here was the problem. The FBI had a problem with surveillance. We just weren't able to follow anyone because way back in the day, in the origins of the FBI, it was a lot of buzz cut, beefy, strong white guys walking down the street, white males walking down the street after a target. And all that Russian had to do was turn around and see a bunch of clones in black suits, like the original Men in Black, and know they were being followed. So America does what America always does. Let's look at how everybody else does it and make it better. So we looked at MI5, and MI5 had this group called the Watchers, and they were awesome. They still are. They would do all sorts of crazy tricks. There was a story about a group of Watchers who cut a hole in the side of a water tank in a water tower and floated a canoe in the water tower and sat in that canoe and watched out the hole to watch their target. I mean, stuff like that. And that's what we wanted in the FBI. So the FBI, way back in the day, in the origins of the ghosts, sent some trainees over to learn from the Watchers, and they brought it back, and we did everything we could to make it our own. That's where the ghosts come from. And so one of the most interesting thing about the ghosts is probably the most diverse group of operatives, of special operatives in the FBI. Because if you are going to follow someone in any sort of environment, you want to be able to blend in. And to do that, you need all races, all sizes, all shapes, all ages. So a team of ghosts would not look like your prototypical idea or Hollywood version of what a group of FBI operatives looks like.
Well, Amanda, go ahead and move the slide. But while she does, let me ask you about Hansen himself. In particular, maybe one day they'll make a prequel to Breach, because Breach is one little part of the Hansen case. Of course, it is the part that matters a lot because it is the arrest and the final getting the evidence that you needed to convict him. But can you, for the listeners out there who don't know the backstory, can you walk us up to the point at which you become involved? How much had the FBI done leading up to that point to look for this spy? They knew they had one.
Right.
But what led to your participation in this case?
Well, Breach is the 3-month investigation of how we caught Hansen. There are 22 years before that where Hansen was the most damaging spy in US history, operating against the United States for the Russians. And during that time, no one in the entire intelligence community had any idea that it was Robert Hanssen, or that the mole, which he was in the FBI. So let's go all the way back to the first day that Hansen decided, I'm going to be a spy, because he chose to be a spy. He wasn't recruited by the Russians. He volunteered his services to the Russians, and he did it in the most clever way. So Robert Hanssen, way back in the day, had joined the FBI. He wanted to be a spy hunter. He wanted to be James Bond, right? And he was put in charge of an analytical unit. Now, analysts in intelligence work are our most important resource. analysts take all the information that field operatives like me gather, and they turn it into what we call actionable intelligence. So without analysts, we can't do anything. They literally are the most important pivotal part of intelligence gathering and counterintelligence. But he wasn't happy about that. In his mind, he wanted to be James Bond, be a field operative leading teams in the field, and they made him a librarian. So he was angry. At the same time, he was married, he was having kids, and he needed money. And where most people would say, I need to take a loan, I need to downsize, I need to borrow from family, he decided, I'm going to spy. So you have that perfect trusted insider. He's a narcissist who was angry at his employer and needed money. And all he needed was that triggering event, and it was a decision to spy. And so what he did is he wrote a letter to the Russians. And in that, he identified a Russian intelligence officer, this is a Soviet back in the day, that we knew was a spy, but he didn't know that we, the FBI, knew he was a spy, right? So by writing that letter to that individual, Hansen breached an immense secret that we had in the United States and gave up 2 other spies that we had overseas, Russians who were working for US intelligence, who were then flown back to Moscow and shot and killed. So in his first act of espionage, he did one of the more egregious acts. And he said, I would like to work for you. This is the amount of money I want, and this is how we're going to communicate, and you'll never know who I am. And he called himself B. Now, later on in this, this relationship with the Soviet Union and then later Russia, because he survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's how good he was, he decided that B must be a really boring name for a spy. So he changed his name to Ramon Garcia. Now, one, I like to think that in his mind, and knowing Hansen the way that I came to know him, he probably thought I need a really cool name because at some point, you know, they're going to learn that the great Ramon Garcia was the greatest spy in U.S. history. So we wanted a cool spy name, a sexy spy name. But, you know, we're thinking about it. Garcia has the letter CIA in it. So maybe he was trying to give a little clue, a false flag. When that came back to the US, they would be hunting at the CIA. And he spent most of his career finding ways to steal information that didn't lead back to him at the FBI, because he knew that our spies in Russia would be trying to figure out who the mole in the intelligence community was. The FBI, the CIA, the NSA, everyone knew we had a mole in the intelligence community for this entire 22 years. The FBI opened an investigation 20 years before we caught Hansen in 2007, called the Gray Day investigation. And we were going after, the Gray Suit investigation. And as we found persons of interest, we would assign them a derivative of that code name, and Hansen's was Gray Day. But we didn't learn about Hansen until 4 months before we arrested him.
Well, I think that's the interesting part, is whether Ramon Garcia or not worked, he made it to where there was a potential suspect at CIA that was the initial person you thought was the bad guy, the mole in this case. That's Brian Kelly.
Yes. So Brian Kelly was an interesting individual. I actually, the first time I met Brian Kelly was after the investigation, after I left the FBI. And I think it was one of the first events that I did as a public speaker at the Canadian Embassy in DC. And he, after I was done speaking, I was shaking hands, and he comes up to me and reached his hand out and said, and just pulled me close, and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And I learned a great poker face in the Hansen investigation. I looked at him and I said, "I'm sorry, sir, I have no idea who you are." And of course, in my mind, I was like, "I know exactly who you are. We spent a year investigating you." Brian Kelly was an individual who was a CIA intelligence officer. He had worked a case called the Felix Bloch case, who was another spy, another US spy for the Russians. And he knew that case intimately. Now, what had happened is the case had gone south at the very end when they were moving in to try and catch the Russian intelligence officer who was working Felix Bloch. And at the last minute, that person got a phone call and ran, and we never were able to scoop him up in Paris. No one knew who was the mole who made that call, but because Kelly had worked that case, and because Kelly had a jogging route that was right near Hansen's drop sites, and they thought that it must be the CIA operative Kelly. And so the FBI, who assumed it was the CIA the entire time, and I have a whole chapter on institutional bias in Gray Day, decided to go full bore on Kelly and was so sure that he was the mole. All of the facts, even though they didn't line up, the FBI was making him the mole. One problem in investigations is if you go into an investigation believing that your target is a bad guy, you will find a way to make them a bad guy, even if they're innocent, which is why you have to go into investigations giving that person the benefit of the doubt. The FBI didn't do that. They went after Brian Kelly for years, and Hansen saw that because he was in the middle of this investigation as an analyst and said, this is great. They're after somebody else. I'm going to reactivate myself and start spying again.
Well, so I'd say one thing that kind of mitigates the blame for the FBI for focusing on the CIA was the fact that Hansen was heavily involved in hunting for this mole, and he could push the investigation in the direction away from himself that no one at FBI could possibly suspect at the time.
Certainly, Hansen was, I like to say, and I start my keynotes by saying that Hansen was our first cyber spy. Hansen was the first spy who was able to penetrate computer systems within his organization, here the FBI, but also part of his job was to work on task forces with other agencies, so he would have access to their computer systems. So when he was stealing information and dropping it under a bridge in Foxstone Park in Virginia so that the Russian intelligence officers could pick it up, he was selectively grabbing information that would lead back to the CIA or the NSA or other agencies, but not the FBI, because that would have got him caught. And so he was able to do that by exploiting computer systems. And certainly when the FBI was the small task force looking for Gray Suit, right? The great spy, the greatest spy that the FBI couldn't find for 22 years. When they were looking for this unknown individual, this mole in the intelligence community, they asked the top Russian analyst for help, and that was Robert Hanssen. And so they went to him and he said, could you put together a list of all of the people in the intelligence community that you think could be this spy? I mean, you know the Russians better than anyone. And he did. And he sent the FBI on massive wild goose chases that led anywhere other than to himself.
Would have been really gangster as if he had put his name on the list also to really throw.
Yeah, right. I'm putting myself on the list because you should look at everybody, but of course, right. Yeah, that would have been pretty good. And he was like that. He had a very snarky sense of humor. So I wouldn't put it past him to do something like that.
Well, let's talk about his personality, because that's, I think, kind of, you're one of the people that can really get inside the head of Robert Hanssen. And so what you're seeing on the screen right now are personal photos that come from the Hanssen family that are part of the Spy Museum collection. As you can see, he did all the regular stuff that everybody else did, went to weddings and, hung out with the grandma and his wife and everything else. But you know him better in many cases than anyone else, because you got kind of almost pulled into the family a little bit. I think that's one of the most interesting things about Breach, is that they do show that really interesting relationship between the two of you. So Amanda, advance the slide. Let me ask you this, Eric. You actually have a couple things in your collection that create a little bit of the relationship that you and Hanssen had. But let me ask you, why were you chosen by FBI to be part of this? And then you can start talking about Hanssen personality.
Right. Well, the good news is, in my research for Breach, I got to reconnect with many of the agents who were working the case. There was a small handful, and in particular, Gene McClellan, who is really a very dear friend, but was my supervisor at the time. And I got to ask him, I said, why exactly did you choose me? Because he was the one who proposed me. The problem the FBI had is they were really behind the curve in computerization. There were computer techs who understood computer systems. There were analysts who understood how to use the computer systems, but there weren't many agents, if any, who understood both the business of computer systems and computer security and investigations and counterintelligence. I'm an old 80s hacker. I mean, this is what I did. I built computers, I wrote programs, back in the day, and I had let that lapse, but I understood computer systems, computer defense, computer security, but also how to breach systems. I was working as a ghost. And I had written a program for the ghost that allowed us to use, to actually type our logs in Microsoft Word instead of handwriting them. This is how behind everything was. And then it would upload into a database I created that did a predictive analysis. And the idea was, I was in law school while I was working for the FBI, and I was thinking that if you can use Westlaw and Nexus and all these sort of case file research libraries, why can't we just search analysis on Russian targets we've been following for years? Because the interesting thing about Russians is they tend to have everything planned out for like a decade, all their drops and all their meets and all their signals. And so if you can see what they've done in the past, you can predict what they're going to do in the future. And you know what? It worked. And so I got some notoriety in the FBI. I say notoriety because when you overstep your boundaries, sometimes there's a bit of a backlash. But here, my supervisor said, this guy knows computers and he knows how to catch spies and he'll be great for it. Now, there were a lot of people who said he'll be terrible, he's going to ruin this. But I was the only choice. The other side of it is I'm Catholic. Hansen, he really did care for his family. He was an upstanding family man, and he was seen as a pillar of the community. He went to church every single day. He was a member of Opus Dei, which is like that's the top level of Catholicism, like way beyond where I ever want to be. And I needed something we could have in common. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to talk about. We couldn't just talk about computers all day. Otherwise, we'd be bored to tears. So we talked about Catholicism. We talked about family. His son at the time was in law school over at Notre Dame, and I was in law school at GW. So we could, he had that commonality. And the more commonalities you have with your target, the more you can get them to talk. Because if you can't get them to talk, you can't get them to hopefully slip up and give you information that leads to that actionable intelligence that the analysts are looking for.
This is a unique experience for you because you had just been observing bad guys from a distance. This is the first time you'd been up close and personal, actually interacting with the person that you had targeted.
Yes, certainly. The first time I've had anything more than a 3-minute conversation with a target. The only other time I had ever spoken to a target was an American who had spied for East Germany way back in the day, and early in my ghost career, we enticed him back, and all my team had to do was pick him up in Dulles Airport. I tell this story in Gray Day in detail, and we lost him, completely lost him. And I was sort of the free safety way back at ground transportation, bored, like listening to the whole team, trying to find him, running around the airport. And out of nowhere, this middle-aged older guy walks up next to me and just asks me, do you know where the Hertz Gold Bus is? And I looked, and there was the target. And I said, well, yes, I do. Come with me. I'll take you. I'll show you. I'm going there too. And then that was the end of the surveillance for the day for me. But I got the target. I caught him. I put him in his Hertz car and read out the license plate to my team and got to go home early. It's the only other conversation I had with a target. With Hansen, it was 8 to 10 hours a day locked in a room with him, just talking about things. And our overt job, my covert job, was find out how we can arrest him if he is the spy we're after. The overt job was build cybersecurity for the FBI. So there was a lot of work we had to do, and we did some very good work.
So what you're looking at the screen, there's a reason there's a pistol on the screen. This is Robert Hanssen's Walther PPK. Should look familiar to anyone who's seen a James Bond movie when Eric talked about wanting to be a special agent in the field and wanting to be James Bond. Here's some evidence of that. He went out, even though he had a service pistol that was issued to him by the FBI, he went out and bought the Bond gun, the Walther PPK. And this is something that you can see on display at the Spy Museum. But Eric, let me ask you, what little mementos have you kept, and what do they tell us about Hansen's personality?
Sure, yeah, I'll show you a few. Well, one, the Walther PPK, he also had a Leica camera, James Bond, from the Bond days, and he could cite Bond movies chapter and verse. He was sort of an odd guy, and look, I love Bond movies, and honestly, the other thing that he absolutely loved that he could cite was Monty Python. He loved the Monty Python movies, and I love those too. So, more things that were commonalities. And as we became more friendly and he started trusting me more, there was a lot more joking around the office. In the beginning, it was terrible. Here's a couple things. Like I said, he went to church every day. He took me to church with him a number of times. And the first time he took me to the Catholic Information Center, a Christian bookstore that has a chapel in the back, and he bought me this copy of The Way. And if you can see that, it's still in the plastic bag because it probably still has his fingerprints on it. But the Way was a small book of small prayers and intentionals that you read every day by the founder of Opus Dei. At the end of the investigation, right? And if you watch the movie Breach, it's absolutely true. I was standing in that office in 9930 with Kate Alleman, who is the Kate Alleman in my book, and she has a different name in the movie. But she was the special agent who was basically in charge of making sure I didn't screw up. And we were looking at the office, and I was looking around the office, and I said, well, where's all his stuff? And she said, well, you know, at the end of cases like this, agents all come in and take a memento. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. And I said, they just come in and take his things? And she said, yeah. So I looked at his desk, and I grabbed this pen. You can see it. It's in this little case. It's a Dr. Pilot Grip Sport pen. This pen is a character in the investigation. It was Hansen's favorite pen in the world. He talked about the pen constantly. And what he did with this pen, I'll use a different pen to demonstrate, is next to my microphone, is this. All day, every hour, constantly. Couldn't stop. He had this nervous, compulsive habit, and he would click, 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 or he would jiggle his keys in his pants. So if he's sitting down, he's clicking. If he's standing, he's jiggling his keys. And I swear, I wanted to just grab this pen out of his hand and stab him with it. I got so tired of that. But I went to Kate and I said, well, I'd like to take something too, and I want that pen. And she said, I think you've earned it, and I've kept it ever since.
So let me ask you at this point about how the case finally broke to your position, because we talked about how good Hansen was at protecting his decades-long spying and how he was able to push the investigation other directions. Anytime a spy is caught, there's something you can point to as that's the moment, or that's the particular time where they screwed up, or happenstance screwed them up. So what happened in the Hansen case that led them to bring someone like you on to finish things off?
Yeah, well, the thing about the Hansen case is the FBI was going after Brian Kelly, but Brian Kelly was not, the CIA operative, but Brian Kelly wasn't giving them anything. They tried to recruit him with a false flag operation. They had a Russian who was working for the FBI pretend he was a Russian intelligence officer. They tried to give him diamonds. They tried to do all sorts of things, and they gave him a polygraph and he passed. And so they were very confused as to why they couldn't catch this guy. So we started working sources overseas. The FBI, this tiny little group that was investigating Gray Suit, worked with a task force in the CIA to try to recruit a source who would give them information. It turned out there was one. Back when the KGB, when the Soviet Union fell and it reformed into the Russian Federation. I mean, you're the historian, you talk more about this than me, but these KGB guys were out of a job. A lot of the KGB was disbanded. Some of them reformed into the SVR and the FSB, which is a whole nother issue, but many of them were out of a job, and they were the kings in a place where everybody was supposed to be equal. So they weren't just going to go work a farm or retire. They stole secrets. They stole all sorts of secrets out of file cabinets in the bowels of Moscow, right? And many of them sold them right away to the US or the UK and made a ton of money, a fortune. They defected. They're public speakers here today in the US. A lot of them work with the Spy Museum, right? They have great lives. But others went into business, became scions, and in this new democratic republic supposed to be, of Russia, and kept those secrets in their attic for a rainy day. Well, one of these guys did, and he sold it based on this source recruitment by the CIA and the FBI in very early 2006. And he sold one little file of secrets and got a ton of money and got to defect to the US and bring his whole family. And here's the other kicker. He also got free college tuition paid for his kids. I don't think it's too late for that joke, right? So yes, you can get free entrance into college and tuition all paid if you're a Russian spy. Yeah, see, there it goes. That works. Anyway, it works a lot better with a whole audience laughing in front of me when I'm on stage. But that little envelope, and he's gone, right? Witness protection, see you later. That little envelope had all of Hansen's mistakes. The two biggest ones. One, he called the Russian embassy once very early when he couldn't find his money. So he would put his drop under Foxstone Bridge, and then he would collect his money, $10,000 or $50,000, under a platform in a nearby amphitheater, all right near where he lived. And he went to the amphitheater one night. He'd go at night with a flashlight when it was closed and walk through and didn't find the money. So he called the embassy, said, "Hey guys, this is Ramon Garcia. Where's my money?" And they were flustered because they'd never talked to him, had no idea who he was. But the Russians, the Soviets, record everything because they were desperate to find out who he was. And they kept it on a cassette tape because that's how long ago this was. And it's the conversation. So it was his voice. They can't do anything with it. The other was he would wrap his drops that he put under that bridge in a trash bag, and his fingerprints were on it. That was a mistake. He should have wiped it down better. The Russians kept all those trash bags. So this intelligence officer who defected, this former KGB intelligence officer who defected, sold this file and sold a cassette tape, some old letters that he had written, and a trash bag for something like $14 million. It's pretty good for a bunch of old junk.
Right.
But the FBI could run prints, and they listened to the tape and they recognized his voice, and they got the partial prints back. And collectively in that room, that small little room, compartmentalized room of FBI agents, their stomachs fell, because one of the guys that they had used on this team was the mole, and had been the mole for 22 years and had been intricately involved in so many aspects of the FBI's counterintelligence work. It was one of the worst people who could be the mole if you were going to make a list. And then it became, let's figure out how we're going to catch him. And that is how I got involved.
And part of catching him was to make sure he didn't know that he was being suspected of this. And so you can see this. This is something also that we have in the Spy Museum collection that's on display. You can see the date on this is January 2001. So this is after the FBI was pretty dang sure, actually right before he was arrested. So after the FBI was pretty sure that he was the bad guy. But the last thing you wanted to do for someone like Hansen was to let on that you suspected him. So they kept giving him awards. They kept promoting him. The job that you were put into was essentially created for him to make him think that he was moving up in the FBI.
Yes. So we learned about him in the middle of 2000, and it wasn't until December that we really had built this idea, December of 2000, this idea to create a new department in the FBI. I mean, it's really brilliant by the FBI. They created an entire new section in the FBI called the Information Assurance Section, which now is what we call cybersecurity. And they said, we need somebody who's going to, they told Hansen, we need somebody who understands computer systems. You've been complaining about this your whole career. We realize that we're way behind the curve in computerization, and you're the only one who can save us, because you're an agent who understands the FBI intrinsically, and you understand computer systems and databases. You've built databases your whole career. We want to put you in charge of building cybersecurity for the FBI. And they flattered him. He had a huge ego. And they said, you won't need to retire. He was going to retire in April of 2001. And we'll put you in place, and you'll have access to everything, and you tell us how to protect our systems. And by the way, we also want you to go out to all the other agencies and find out how they do information assurance so that we can do it better than they do. So they were giving him access to everything so he could spy, so we could catch him red-handed in the act of espionage.
So, man, if you move to slide 2, the first one you'll see that you'll go by right there is a sign to an amphitheater that we have in the collection that was one of the dead drops that Hansen used. The picture on the right is a FBI photo of recovered $100 bills that Hansen was paid by the Russians in this case. Go one more. There it is. Okay, so anyone who knows the story will recognize this. In fact, this is the actual Palm Pilot. You come to the Spy Museum, you can see the real one. You're intimately familiar with this. Can you walk us through the importance of this particular artifact?
Sure. I'm sure if you dusted that Palm Pilot for print, you'd find mine on there too. Yeah, this Palm Pilot was how I broke the case. We were having trouble because we just didn't have anything that would link Robert Hanssen in the year 2000, right, with Ramon Garcia Orbi from the 80s when he did most of his espionage. We had to find a way to link the two. Even if he made a drop in 2000, we wouldn't be able to prove that he was actually the spy. He could just say, well, this is the first thing I've ever done, and we'd have conspiracy to commit espionage maybe in 25 years, which he'd do in a heartbeat. But we really needed to catch him red-handed and link him to all his espionage from all those years so that we could put the pressure on him to get him to tell us what he did so we could fix it. And that was the most important thing. It was actually more important than punishing him. So I was supposed to look for clues. And, you know, I've said this many times, but criminals have routines, right? We all have routines, but criminals especially have routines to protect information. And Hansen's was, he would take this device, the Palm Pilot, that he loved more than anything else. He would tell me that in order to be any kind of executive, to be efficient, to organize your life, you have to have a digital assistant. And if you don't, you're back in the Stone Ages and you're going to be left behind by everyone else who's better than you are. I said, okay. And as I was watching him, I realized that he kept it in his left back pocket all the time whenever he stood up. But it was such, I mean, you can't see the side of this device, but it's like that thick. So that's a big thing to have in your back pocket. Every time he sat down, he'd have to pull it out and he'd put it in his bag, which he kept right at the next to his desk. And when he stood up, he would grab it like clockwork and put it back in his back pocket. So he was never away from it. And I asked him about it, and I said, what's the story with that? And, you know, he said, well, you'll never understand because you're just a do nothing, no good, lousy clerk. I said, really? And he said, yes. And, you know, if you wanted to ever organize your life, you would have something like this, not that paper thing you kept on your desk. I had like one of the old school big paper things, and I would write notes about everything we needed to do. So I went to the Office of Science and Technology. I requisitioned a Palm Pilot. The Palm 5 was out. This is a 3X. So I got a Palm 5 and I got another one for him. I tried to give it to him and he pushed it back across the table and he said, I don't need that thing. I'll keep my baby right here. You know, I've written the encryption on this myself. That's a big clue. And so I said, we got to get that away from him. We have to. And so we went into what I call in my book, but we call in the FBI the operational term shenanigans. We needed to find a way to get him away from the Palm Pilot, or the Palm Pilot away from him, with sufficient time to copy it and get it back before he knew it was gone. So we needed what you call in more technical terms a pretext. We needed to hack Hansen. We needed to social engineer him. You want me to go into that story?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a great story.
So here's what we did. We used everything we learned about him. He seriously had a disrespect for authority. Anyone above him in the chain of command he thought was a complete buffoon. He didn't like to be interrupted. He really likes to shoot. The dude had a couple of guns on him in the office. He loved shooting. He would talk about his weapons all the time. And so we had the section chief, Richard Garcia, who worked down the hall, who was the only person I knew on that floor or in the entire FBI headquarters, other than the director of the FBI who knew about the case, come in unannounced with an assistant director that Hansen specifically didn't like. In fact, this is an assistant director that Hansen had tasked me to go into this guy's office one night and steal the art from his walls and put him up in the skiff. So I thought this will be great because now this guy's going to come in unannounced. I said this guy needs to be the one who does it. So he would see the art on the walls, right? And really fluster Hansen. So they come in unannounced, and the ADIC, assistant director in FBI speak, slaps $20 on Hansen's desk and says, I'll bet you that 20, 5 targets out of 5, I will beat you. Let's go shoot right now. And Hansen says, I'm far too busy. I've got too much going on. He's really flustered. He's red in the face. He's not looking at them. He's not making eye contact. And the ADIC says, I don't think you understand. That's not a request. And so he's angry, and he grabs his ear protection, eye protection. He holsters his firearm. For the first time, he forgets to grab the Palm Pilot, and he goes down to shoot. And I'm super excited because we tried this a few times, and it hadn't worked. And finally, it worked. Finally, we got it right. I go into the bag, grab the Palm Pilot, run down 3 flights of steps, and hand it off to a tech team. And as they're copying the Palm, a data card, and a floppy disk, I mean, we're going back in time now to the year 2000, right? Actually 2001 at this point. This is February. He's, he apparently, and I've seen the video, right? So the section chief Garcia got me the video and showed me of the shooting range, and he hangs his target, he sends it down the line, he pulls out his firearm, he fires a clip, he holsters the fire alarm, he brings the target back, he looks at it, and then he just turns around and leaves. Doesn't say a word, doesn't grab his target off the line, just turns around and leaves. And by the way, he hit like the bullseye every time. So this isn't the guy you want to be in a gunfight with. And I get a page from my asset down there in the shooting range saying, don't know what happened, out of pocket, probably coming to you. So I knocked on the door and told the tech team, guys, I'm going to need those devices. And they said, we're almost done. I said, you don't understand. He's on his way up. I got to get there before him because he's angry and he's armed and I'm not. And if we want to keep this investigation going, I got to get it there. So, it's not their life on the line. They're like, whatever, we'll get it done. And I knew I had 9 solid minutes. And I got in there, I slammed the big door to the skip behind me. I get to his office, I get to his bag, and I've got like a cool 2 minutes. So I'm sauntering in there. I'm feeling good. Like I broke the case. I know the information we need is in there. It has to be on there. I look at his bag and I realize there are 4 pockets and I have 3 devices and I have no clue. So what do, right? I mean, I'm kneeling down in front of his bag. I know he's on his way up. He's going to come in any minute. And I decide I'll self-hypnotize. Like seriously, that's what went through my head. I'm going to self-hypnotize. I'm going to remember that moment, right? And that doesn't work, by the way. There's no way that happens. And I hear him coming through the door. So I just dropped all the devices, zipped up all the bags, ran to my desk with the best poker face I've ever had and ever will have, ever. I used it all up right there. He glares at me, goes into his office, slams the door, and I hear zip. And I sat there knowing that if I wasn't there when he came back out, I would blow this investigation because he would have gone right into paranoia. And he comes out and he stares at me and he says, were you in my office? I said, sure, I put a memo in your inbox. Didn't you see it? And I had. And he looks at me and he looks at me and I kept just a face like this on and, I'm sweating down here, but I look great here. And I just looked at him finally. I said, what? And he says, I don't want you in my office again. And he leaves for the day. And then 3 days later, after a long weekend, he's on the bridge in Foxstone Park. He makes his last drop to the Russians. He walks back on that old trail back to where his car is parked, and the FBI arrests him because we knew exactly where he'd make that drop and when, because of that Palm Pilot.
So Amanda, can you move it to my favorite picture of Robert Hanssen is in the next slide. There it is. and to the other thing on there are the handcuffs that arrested Hanssen. You can also, it's going to sound like a broken record. You can also see those on display at the International Spy Museum. Can you go one more, Amanda?
Actually, if you stay on that one really quick,
go back.
There are actually 2 arrest photos of Hanssen. They had to retake the arrest photo. So if you look at, and I mentioned this in the book too, there are a lot of Easter eggs from the case in the book. If you look down where it says 65A, that's FBI code for a traitor. And Hanssen, holding that sign the first time, put his finger over the 65A on purpose, even if it was subconscious, he didn't want to be seen as the traitor. And so they didn't catch it at first, and they had to go back and retake the photo where he's holding it. So that's why he looks a little bit more sullen there.
Can you kick it ahead 2, Amanda? Skip the next one and go to the, all right. So this is where Hanssen is now. He's still alive, though no one's going to talk to him anytime soon. This is the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. To the right of the picture are some of Hanssen's prison mates, the worst of the worst, from Terry Nichols, who was Tim McVeigh's partner in Oklahoma City. McVeigh was there before he was executed. To all the horrible terrorists, from Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon, to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, to people like Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, to Eric Rudolph, who is the Atlanta Olympics bomber, and a bunch of mob bosses and serial killers and pedophiles. Yeah. How much must it piss Hanssen off to be in a place with these scumbags? He has to think that he doesn't belong here, just from what you know of his personality.
Yeah. Absolutely. I saw a picture that was snapped when he was ushered into Supermax, and he's got this smirk on his face. And I saw a recent picture someone sent to me just recently. I mean, people read the book and then they work there and they send me stuff where he just looks completely beaten down and broken. It almost makes you feel bad because this is the worst place in the world you could be. It was designed for people who are so destructive and so violent they cannot come into contact with guards, which by the way works for spies because there's no one they can recruit because they have no contact with other people. See, a spy who's locked up can recruit a guard to start working for them. It's happened in the past. So it's a really terrible place to be. He has to be completely miserable. I know that the only thing he's allowed to read are paperback books, and because Gray Day just came out in paperback a few weeks ago, now I can finally send him a book. I did try to get to Supermax to interview him. I wanted that to be the epilogue to Gray Day. I couldn't get to him. I mean, he's buried so deep. I couldn't even find a way to get to him. The FBI's like, I don't know. You'll have to talk to his attorney. I talked to the attorney, and he laughed at me and said, you should talk to the family. And I wasn't willing to do that. So, maybe I'll find a way. I'll do the head of the Bureau of Prisons. Someone gave me his contact. Maybe, who knows? But I'm definitely sending him a paperback.
Let me wrap this up by asking about the movie. People may have seen Breach. You talked about having a souvenir from the Hansen case. Do you have any souvenirs from the filming of that movie? Because I know you were a consultant on the movie. Did you grab anything off set?
Oh yeah, I worked very closely with all the departments of the movie. The director, Billy Ray, was awesome. He really got me involved, and really for me the best part of the movie was getting that inside look at all aspects of how you make a Hollywood movie. It's like a mini corporation that stands up with hundreds of people. But yeah, I kept all sorts of stuff. The prop department gave me all sorts of things. I have the Dr. Pilot Sport Grip pen that Chris Cooper used playing Hansen. I have the Palm Pilot from the movie. I have the pagers from the movie. I have all sorts of stuff with Ryan Phillipe's face on it. Pretending he's me for the movie. So this is my favorite though, because I had to turn in my badge when I left the FBI. But I have the badge, the FBI badge and credentials from Breach, which I love, and I'll pull them out sometimes when I'm doing presentations, especially for kids and young adults. And the neat thing here is it also has the credentials for Ryan Phillipe playing Eric O'Neill in the movie Breach. It's actually my signature on there and Ryan Phillipe's face. So it's a pretty cool Easter egg from the movie. The neat thing is, because I had photos of my credentials back in the day, and I gave them to the props department, and they couldn't use them. They're not allowed to recreate the badge. They have to make everything a little different. So if you look really carefully there, you can't really see unless you look close, but there's nothing on there. It's just raised. Yeah, there's no letters, there's no words, there's nothing. And the badge, the credentials are also changed, although it does say investigative specialist. So, every once in a while I wonder, should I just keep this in my car in case I get jobbed by it? But then I'm impersonating a federal agent and I'd get a lot of trouble.
That would be a bad news story for everyone.
Yeah, probably.
So, Amanda, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I'm sure there are several from those that are out there listening.
Yeah, I will pop back.
Okay.
We have some really, really wonderful questions. People want to know, Eric, do you think if it hadn't been for the ex-KGB traitor, do you think Hansen would have been caught, or what would have been the timeline?
So if it hadn't been for that ex-KGB traitor, Hansen would have retired. He was going to retire in April. He was going to take a job at a cybersecurity company, and he'd still be a spy. He'd just be a corporate spy. Could you imagine? Working in a cybersecurity, especially with what cybersecurity is today. I mean, I say all the time, all espionage now is cyber spying almost. You would not want to have one of the worst traitors in US history working within a company that you trust to protect all your data. But yeah, he would have walked. He would have left the FBI. He would have not going to make that last drop. He was put in a position to make that drop by being brought into the information assurance section. And even if he did, there's no sense that we would have caught him, and he would be retiring right now.
What about, people want to know, do you think it was reckless when he made the phone call to the Russians, or like by leaving the fingerprint on the garbage bag? Was that recklessness, or what do you chalk that up to?
The phone call to the Russians was very reckless. There were a couple of points in his career where he made terrible mistakes. and I outline all of them in Gray Day, but the mistakes were never caught from the FBI because the FBI wasn't at that point designed to catch a traitor within. They were always looking for traitors in other agencies. You know, the interesting thing I say, and in Gray Day is Hansen really is the modern architect of the FBI because of what he did, the FBI had to redesign how it protects information, how it protects intelligence, and how it continually seeks out those within the FBI who might become trusted insiders. Like so much more auditing. You know, for example, if the FBI had just been auditing, tracking which people were accessing what within their databases, they would have had a pretty good clue that Hansen was potentially the mole, but they weren't doing it.
People want to know, did you get to participate in the interview after his arrest?
No, I didn't. In fact, I did not see him. I wasn't at the arrest. There were two arrest plans. The first was to arrest him when he made that drop. The second was to wait until we were all back in the office on a Tuesday, and I was going to drive him to Quantico and hand him off to the arrest team, which is what I was advocating for. I thought that it would have been a better way to do it. It would have been more of a genteel. I just thought his personality would have felt more flattered if it was done that way in an isolated place, away from his neighborhood, away from his parents. But I think that when the FBI learned that this was the spy we'd been after for 22 years, there was a lot of anger. And so he was arrested right in his neighborhood after making the drop. So no, the last conversation I had with Hansen was a Friday before he was arrested on a Sunday. And I don't know why this popped in my head, why I said it, other than maybe in the future we'll have time travel and I'll go back in time and tell myself to do it because it's such a great story. But in that last moment when he was leaving the office for the day on that Friday before he was about to be arrested, I said, "Hey, boss." And he stopped and he looked back at me and I said, "I'll catch you later." And he kind of gave me a look and he said, "Well, okay, Eric, I'll see you on Monday," or on Tuesday actually, because Monday was President's Day weekend. And he leaves for the day. And I remember just putting my head down on my desk and thinking, why did I say that? I might have just ruined the whole case. Is he going to spend the weekend wondering why Eric said that and not make that drop that we know he's going to make because of the Palm Pilot? But he did make the drop, and I got a great story with it.
If you could ask him one question, if you had gotten into Supermax to see him, what is if you have one question, what would it be?
Yeah. My mission. Right? My mission was to get in touch with him, get into Supermax, sit across from him, not stutter, and ask him this question: why did you do it? Because he has never answered that for anyone. All those years of being interrogated by 4 different commissions who were put in place to learn what he'd done, he refused steadfastly to ever answer that question. And whenever he was asked it hundreds of times, he said, "You don't need to know that to fix anything, to change anything, to understand what I did. That's mine." And I think he kept that to himself because it's his last scrap of power that he had. It was the last ability to shirk authority that he had. And I think he'd tell me.
Yeah. Do you, folks want to know what was the review process for getting Gray Day published so you didn't leak any secrets?
Yeah, before I could publish the book, before actually anyone else read it, I had to take the full manuscript and submit it to the FBI's Office of Pre-Publication Review. There were some great agents there who their job is to read things and go to the appropriate people within the FBI, and for me, it was the counterintelligence unit, to give them certain things. And the idea is to make sure that someone who has left the FBI, and we have a lifetime requirement to go through pre-publication review for FBI stories that we write, that there was nothing I inadvertently put in there by mistake or purposefully, I guess some people might do, that would be classified. Now, I felt pretty confident because a lot of what I was writing was placed in the court documents to arrest Hansen, and also a movie had been made about me. But the book is very intimate, and it goes way deeper into the case and what was happening behind the case, especially with interviews that I did with people working the case, than has ever been made before. There is no book that goes into the case in that detail and into that 3 months of the case. So a lot of it was classified, including the code name for Hansen, which was Gray Day, and the FBI decided to allow a lot of it to go through, which was great. They struck a lot of stuff too. anything that talked about the CIA, including some old CIA cases that I outlined in there, I had to remove because I didn't want it to go to the agency for pre-publication review, because we wouldn't have a book to read right now. It would still be there.
Good thinking. Here's one that's really near and dear to your and my heart, because this is in the License to Thrill film in the new museum. Someone wants to know if that scene in Breach where he takes you out into Rock Creek Park and pulls the gun, is that real or is that Hollywood, Eric?
That is Hollywood. The two scenes that are the two scenes in Breach that are most Hollywood, and there's good reasons for both, but the two scenes in Breach that are most Hollywood is that shooting scene. He never drove me out into the park and never shot a gun at me. And the elevator scene. I never saw him after his arrest. I would have had to see him every day if he had not pled guilty, because I would have had to testify to the entire chain of evidence we collected to arrest Hansen. So I would have been on stage in the courtroom the whole time testifying, and that would have been a little nerve-wracking. I was actually kind of nervous about that. But no, I never saw him. So those are the two scenes that I have to answer that question all the time. But it's still an amazing movie. The central investigation, the two guys in a room, if you read Gray Day and you watch Breach, you'll see how much of that is very accurate.
I have one personal question, and then Vince might want to have one before we wrap up. But mine is, you always say I had 9 minutes to get back up the stairs, and I realized, as someone who'd done all sorts of surveillance, had you walked that, or did you walk that at his pace? How did you know it was 9 minutes?
I literally over lunch one day ran it. I ran it and I timed it so that I caught every elevator first time I hit the button. I looked like a fool. I'm running around the FBI headquarters, but I wanted to give myself a cushion. So I knew that no matter how much he hurried, I had 9 minutes, unless he could teleport or something, or he had a secret way through, right? So there's no way you catch the elevator the first time. The FBI headquarters is the most bizarre building ever built on Earth. It should just be. I'm an advocate for getting rid of it and building a nice new headquarters building, because it really is depressing. You walk in and you're immediately depressed, and then you get lost and you're even more depressed because you feel foolish. It's a hard building to get around. So I knew I had that 9 minutes at least, but I wasn't going to give myself any more than that. So I was timing it on my watch.
That makes sense. So it's as fast, as fast as you could go running was at least how long it would take. So that's.
Yeah, when I do my surveillance courses with the Spy Museum, I always tell all of my operatives about Murphy's Law. Like, you're going to be out there, we're going to be following my rabbit, you're going to be trying to do everything, you're going to feel really good, and something will go wrong, because something always goes wrong. So you have to plan for it. And, that was me planning for something that would definitely go wrong, and it went wrong almost catastrophically, but because I had planned, we were okay.
Well, let me wrap up with the final question. I've talked to you about this in the past, but I think it's interesting enough that the audience might find something to think about as they kind of go on and finish off their day. If we could shift the timeline to modern day, let's say Hansen is still in the FBI today. He's not yet retired. He's still spying for them. How much harder would it have been to catch Robert Hanssen in 2020 with the technology that we have today but going back to 2000 or the 1990s?
Yeah, Hansen understood the computerization intrinsically. So he truly understood the way that the FBI secured its data in those days and was able to steal information. Now, remember, in the beginning of Hansen's espionage, he was still stealing paper. As the FBI computerized, he was always ahead of it. Today, you can steal terabytes of information. An enormous truckloads of the equivalent in paper and put it on one thumb drive. And now spies don't even use thumb drives. They just upload it to their intelligence officer over the internet through all sorts of different file sharing sites. So a Hansen in the FBI today, knowing what he knew with the same sort of circumstances, would be absolutely devastating.